All right, guys, you should have a note sheet in front of you that says, how does DNA control traits? So as you're watching this screencast, you need to make sure that you're filling the notes as you go. If it goes a little too fast for you, just pause it and make sure that you write in all the information that is required, because you are responsible for this stuff. If you have any questions, kind of make a note for yourself, and you can ask me at any time or just raise your hand during the screencast and just flag me down. All right, so we have already talked about our first LEQ. We've already answered how is DNA replicated. We looked at the structure of DNA. We looked at how it copies itself. And now we're going to move on to our next LEQ, which is dealing with proteins and how they're produced in the cell. And you might be thinking, wait a minute, I thought this unit was on DNA. What does that have to do with proteins? Well, we know that DNA is what makes us individual. We look at all of the faces around us, all of the people in the world, and no two people look alike, with the exception of identical twins because they share DNA. And we know that DNA is what makes us unique. But what we usually don't talk about, or what general knowledge doesn't tell us, is that DNA actually codes for our proteins, and really it's our proteins that make us unique. Our proteins give us our different hair color and our different skin color and the different traits about us. So even though the credit goes to DNA, it's really indirectly the proteins that are going to make us unique. So we're going to talk about how is it that proteins are produced in the cell, and how does DNA code for those proteins in our cells. So that's where we're headed. So we already know that proteins make up all living things. They are one of the organic macromolecules that we talked about back in our biochem unit. So what I want you to do is just list a couple of examples for yourself on your note sheet. You don't have to list all of them that you see here, but just kind of skim through. We've talked about how proteins make up our hair and our nails. We know that proteins make up our muscles. There's some proteins in our blood, specifically something called hemoglobin that carries oxygen to our blood. There's also proteins involved in our brain and our nerve cells. You know that enzymes are made of proteins. We've talked about that a lot. And then there's some other things here you can just kind of skim through. So jot down a couple of examples for yourself, just to kind of remind yourself that proteins make up all living things. So looking at the structure of proteins. Again, we've talked about this before, so some of this is review. We know that proteins are made up of amino acids. Amino acids are the monomers, or the single units that build the protein itself. So if you look at this diagram down here, each one of these little colored balls is representing an amino acid or a monomer, and they build to make these long chains of amino acids that, if you think back, that's called a polypeptide. Poly means many, peptide means protein. So these polypeptides, or these many proteins, bend and fold together to actually make the protein. Okay, so how do we get the different proteins? Well, they're made of the 20 amino acids. I kind of skipped over that. Let me back up for a second. There are exactly 20 amino acids. So if this diagram was correct, there'd be exactly 20 different colors in here, no more, no less. We know what all of the amino acids are. We know their names. We know their structures. We'll talk about those a little bit more specifically later. So how do we get the different proteins? Well, we combine the 20 different amino acids together in different combinations. So if you take those 20 amino acids, they can repeat. So you might have the same amino acid repeated over and over again, or you might have, all different amino acids. But if you take those 20, you can get all kinds of different combinations to make up all of the different proteins that are going to make up our body. So what else do proteins do for us? Well, they help fight disease. They are involved with our immune system. They help to build our new body tissue, like our muscles and our skin and our hair. We've talked about that. They make up enzymes. We've mentioned those, even with DNA synthesis. We've talked about the enzymes, helicase and DNA polymerase, that are involved there. So the enzymes speed up chemical reactions. They help with reactions that deal with our digestion, digesting our food. We have things called digestive enzymes that help you to break down your food. And they do all kinds of other things in our body as well. Enzymes are also a part of our cell membrane. If you think back, we mentioned these very briefly. We have our phospholipid bilayer here. We also have these channel proteins that help larger molecules to go through. We also have these other proteins that are on the outside of the cell that have different jobs that we can talk about later as well. So in addition to building our muscles and things like that, proteins are very important in our bodies. There's all kinds of things that they're doing. So next question, where are proteins made? You're already answering this in your head, I hope. The proteins are made in the ribosome. So when we look at our cell model that we've seen before, we have our ER, or our endoplasmic reticulum, And this is our rough ER. Why is it rough ER? Because it has ribosomes attached to it. Those are these little dots. If you zoom in on one of these ribosomes, they're actually more complicated than just a little dot. They actually have different structures to them. They have something called mRNA moving through them. They have tRNA. They have the amino acid chain that's being built. And we're going to talk about that more later. But I just wanted to give you a heads up that proteins aren't, or not proteins, the ribosomes, they're not just little tiny dots the way we've been showing them. They're actually a little bit more complicated than that. So we will talk about that a little bit later. Okay, so we've been talking about DNA, and we know that DNA is found in the nucleus. And I just told you that the DNA is going to code for our proteins, and that's really what makes us who we are, is the proteins that we have. But if DNA is in the nucleus, and proteins we know are made in the ribosomes, how does that happen? Ribosomes are in the cytoplasm, DNA is in the nucleus, so how does the DNA in the nucleus code for the proteins that are made in the ribosomes, which are in the cytoplasm? So that might be a little confusing. Well, there's actually a process that takes place, and this process is called protein synthesis, which helps the code from the DNA be transcripted and translated, and we'll talk about what that means in a minute, into the ribosomes, which are in the cytoplasm, so that they can make the proteins. So I know that was a lot to take in, but let's break it down. So we have this process called protein synthesis. You know that synthesis means to make. How do we make proteins? Well, it starts with our DNA and ends up in the ribosome. We call this process the central dogma. I don't usually use this term. It's just, I don't know, it sounds weird to me, but you might see it somewhere. I don't know, like a Keystone question, it might talk about the central dogma. It's kind of the central idea or the central process that everybody kind of agrees on. And what the central dogma says, or the whole idea behind protein synthesis, is basically this. You start with DNA, which we know is in the nucleus. That DNA is transcripted into RNA. So if you look at the word part script means to write. So if you have people in a play, those of you who might be participating in the musical this year, script means to write, and you read a script, and the script tells you what to do. It's the written directions of what you're supposed to do in the play. So what's happening in transcription is the DNA is being rewritten in another form. It's giving directions to the RNA about how it's supposed to work. So we're rewriting the DNA into a different set of directions, basically, and we're rewriting it into what we call RNA. Then that RNA, which is another nucleic acid, is going to be translated into a protein, and we call that process translation, kind of like translating from one language to another. So if you're taking a language here, you're taking Spanish, German, whatever, you have to translate from English to Spanish or vice versa. So it's the same idea here. We have this code that's written in the form of RNA, and it gets translated into the form of a protein. Your body can't understand what the RNA is saying. It can't understand what the DNA is saying, but it can understand what the protein is trying to do. So we start with DNA. It's transcripted or rewritten into a code in the form of RNA. Then it is translated into a protein.